All right, well, everyone, this is your Sunday morning. Thank you so much for spending it here with us and this really esteemed panel. I'm really excited to host everyone. My name is Michelle. I will be moderating the panel, and I want to get a pulse in the room. So how many people work in climate? Okay, lots of people. How many people work somewhere in the ocean space? Wonderful, okay. And how many people are just here to kind of learn? You know, you're at South by Southwest, listening to some music and learning some new stuff. Great. That is exactly the crowd that we want here. We want to create some agents of change and people who don't hear about oceans a lot, so thank you for being here. So my name is Michelle, and I'm the founder of Clever Carbon and Women in Climate. And at Clever Carbon, we teach people about carbon footprint in a really hip and fun way. And Women in Climate, we create a joyful and safe space for more women to learn and talk about climate. And what I'm passionate about is raising awareness on climate issues, getting it into the mainstream. I'm passionate about the education piece, not just talking about climate, but understanding like what are the issues that we're dealing with. And I'm also really passionate about inspiring action. And so this panel was really important to me because, you know, 2 years ago, I really didn't think a lot about the oceans. But one of the stats that come back to me is that our planet is 30% land and 70% oceans, but the proportion that we talk about the oceans definitely does not reflect that. And I remember someone once said, you know, if a Martian flew by our planet, they would think that everyone lived in the oceans, right? 70%. But obviously, we only see land, so we don't think about it that much. So this is a really important topic today. I think everyone's going to learn a lot, and hopefully we'll walk away with some action that we can all take. So with that, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brad Ack. I am the CEO of an organization called Ocean Visions, which works at the nexus of the ocean and the climate crises, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute. I've been in the environmental community my whole career, which is now in its 4th decade, shockingly, and sort of chasing the specter or trying to outrun the specter of climate change in every conservation organization I've worked in, and having that delta between our trying to outrun it and it catching up, ever decreasing, and now, you know, being overwhelmed and overrun essentially by the disruption that we're causing on the planet, much of which is in the ocean and that we're going to talk about today. But we're also going to talk about possible solutions and resetting our agenda, and not just about how bad things are, but how we can make them better. But it's going to take a real pivot in our thinking.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kate Moran. I'm President and CEO of Ocean Networks Canada, and we operate Canada's largest ocean observing system. Much of our infrastructure is on the west coast of Canada, but now we're growing our observations to actually observe the ocean around all of Canada's 3 coasts. And for those not familiar with Canada, Canada has the longest coastline in the world. So we're there to study all aspects of the ocean. But now we're starting to concentrate more on using our infrastructure, all the sensor systems we have. We deliver data 24/7 in real time, but we're now focusing more on a couple different things. Understanding the ways that we can enhance the ocean to remove more CO2 from the atmosphere, but also to conduct the research necessary to ensure that if we do go down those paths, we'll be able to do it in a way that balances risk in a way that helps keep the planet with rich biodiversity and habitable for humans. And we're also happy to begin to go down the path of helping startup companies who have technologies to put them on our platform to actually move them to a higher level of technical readiness.
Hi, my name is Marty Odlin. I'm the founder and CEO of Running Tide. Running Tide builds, it's a startup company in Portland, Maine, 6 years old. We build the tools, techniques, and infrastructure to enable ocean health solutions at, you know, Earth system scale. You know, our company was founded basically by in a community that had been, you know, affected pretty substantially by climate change, losing opportunities to fish, et cetera. And what we like to think about is, you know, in the past we had 2 approaches to the oceans. We kind of harvested and exploited, or we like protect exclusively and like don't touch. And, you know, we like to think that we're building the 3rd way, which is to positively intervene to hopefully forestall the worst effects of climate change. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. So we hear about climate today in the news. It is talked about. There is awareness around that, but I think that it really isn't truly reflecting the urgency, and the oceans have masked a lot of the damage so far. Brad?
That is exactly right. I mean, this is the tough part of the session. It will get better, but this is the tough part. Basically, the oceans have masked most of the very worst, most devastating effects of the climate crisis, the climate disruption that we have caused to date. And this is an interlocking crisis. These are two sides of the same coin, and they can't be solved in separation from the other. So we're all ocean-focused people working on climate issues because climate threats are the biggest threats to the ocean. And let me just talk a little bit about this. There's two giant stressors coming from this disrupted climate. We are trapping enormous amounts of excess heat on the planet because of this blanket of heat-trapping pollution that we've put into the atmosphere over the last couple of centuries. It's sort of an almost unimaginable amount of heat. This is just a graphic that shows how much the ocean has heated over the last century, but it's calculated right now we're putting 14 zettajoules of heat into the ocean, excess heat that otherwise would have been reflected into space. Now, I'm guessing not many people know what a zettajoule is, but a joule is a basic unit of energy like a watt, and a zetta is 23 zeros behind it. So it's a staggering amount of heat, far more heat every year being trapped in the ocean than what we produce as all of human activity on land. And it's calculated in an easier way to think about it, about the equivalent of 7 Hiroshima bomb size explosions of heat energy going into the ocean anybody want to guess? Every second. Every second of every minute, every hour, every day, the hour that we're here, 7 bomb equivalents per second. So it's a staggering amount of heat. It is disrupting the ocean in a lot of ways. First, it accelerates sea level rise because warmer water expands. It's about 30 to 50% of all sea level rise. Warmer water holds less oxygen. We've measured oxygen declines across the global ocean around 2%, but it varies, which of course has a big impact on biodiversity and things we care about. It's intensifying these marine heat waves that lead to coral bleaching. It's interrupting mixing between the upper and the mid layer of the ocean, so where all the nutrient exchange happens that basically feeds much of the food chain, and that's because all this heat is trapped in the top layer of the ocean, and that thermocline is stopping the mixing. Much more powerful storms. I was trapped in California a week ago as a result of this phenomenon, but we're seeing these crazy storms, loss of sea ice and ice sheets, which are so important to the climate stability of the planet, much of which is being lost because of warming water. And then finally, a poleward migration of species to get away from the heat. These outstrip any other impacts that we're causing to the ocean, and they cannot be stopped or turned off until that concentration of atmospheric CO2 starts to come down. Full stop. There's no other way to cool. I mean, there are some intermediate steps like solar radiation management, but over the long term, the only thing that returns this to normal is restoring the climate. And remember, the title of this talk was Repair. The other big stress is chemical. About 700 gigatons of CO2, 700 billion tons have gone into the ocean over the last 180 years. We're all freaking out about 30 million tons of plastic a year, right? This is orders of magnitude higher than that. It's just a pollutant that we can't see, but it is changing the very chemistry of the ocean. It's increased ocean acidity by about 30%, which has an effect on any organism that forms a shell, from very microscopic to larger, and enormous risks and unknowns. And again, a curve that is only going in one direction until we turn off the tap.
Well, thanks for that positive positive view about the climate.
We'll get to positive.
I'm going to continue to depress you for the next minute or so. Yeah, we're going to come out of this, don't worry. I just want to share with you some of my previous research, where lessons from deep time, where I had the honor of actually drilling in the Central Arctic Ocean and recovering one of the most unique paleoclimate records from the sediment in the Arctic Ocean. And you can see this is an image of the Arctic Ocean covered in sea ice in the summer time, which we call perennial sea ice, summer and winter. And it was published at the time. But what we learned was that we learned many things about this paleoclimate record in the ocean, but we learned that that sea ice cover, perennial sea ice, has been around in the climate system, as Brad just mentioned, for 15 million years. And it's going to be gone in our lifetimes. So it's just showing the disruption is massive, but we can also learn from other aspects of the paleoclimate. This just shows you two different graphs. Time is on the axis going from 0 to 20,000 years, and on the y-axis is heat. The blue line is a past climate event called scientists call it the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. I call it the big heat. And what happened then was that was about the same amount of CO2 or greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere. It was mass extinction event, but what you're seeing in red is what we're doing today. So we know from the geologic record that these mass heating events cause extinction. And so it's just a wake-up call to see that we know this has happened on the planet in the past, and we need to start acting like we know that. And so today, what we're also seeing is that aspects of our climate system are tremendously disrupted. And because of the fact that there is loss of sea ice in the Arctic, it changes the temperature coming from the ocean into the atmosphere that breaks down what's called the polar vortex, which has been this circulation system at the top of our planet that kept the cold air there very locked in place, very, very conveniently. Now, as many of you know, some of you live in areas of the United States that have experienced these extreme weather events. It's because of that polar vortex is no longer stable, causing the jet stream to be wobbly and having those extreme events, extreme cold and extreme hot, hitting us. And not only that, it hits us in a way that impacts our economy. So now we're seeing increase of not only these weather events, but also other climate impacts that is hitting our pocketbooks. And so it's not only an aspect of understanding it from keeping the climate, the planet habitable for us in biodiversity, but it's costing us dollars.
That was a lot. I think there were lots of new words in there that we don't really talk about on a daily basis. Sea ice, polar vortex, thermal stress. So I challenge you to use those words today, 3 times each, sea ice and polar vortex in vocabulary. But we've seen how the effects of climate change have impacted the oceans and how it's impacted our sea ice, but it also impacts our communities and the people who live by the sea and depend on the sea and the oceans. And so Marty, will you walk us through that a bit?
Yeah, every time I hear Brad and Kate talk, I get pretty upset. Because it's like, what we're talking about is like everything. Well, I mean, I'm from a waterfront community and love to surf and fish, and everyone I know is engaged in nature in some way. And like we run some operations with shellfish and aquaculture, and we're seeing it every day. Like we can see, and it's affecting people. It's affecting opportunities. It's affecting the health of communities. It's affecting the health of people in communities. What opportunities they have. I'm from a family that has been engaged in fisheries for a long time. I have little kids. Like my dream was to have a boat with them and like teach them to fish. And the fish are gone. Mackerel are gone. They swam north. And we can see what's happening in communities like Dutch Harbor, Alaska, where the Alaskan crab fishery just collapsed this year. Sort of unknown, but most like it's thermal stress and acidification. Langoustine lobster off the east coast of Iceland. Iceland manages their fisheries better than anyone in the world, and they had a climate-driven collapse of a fishery. We can see phytoplankton levels dropping in the bay. We can see the color of our bay is changing color. Like from when I was a kid, it was blue, then it turned green, now it's kind of turning yellow. Like this isn't, the effects, and it trickles down through, every aspect of a community. And it's not happening in one community like mine. It's happening in every coastal community around the world. Everywhere I go, people are seeing the same thing. So, we're not talking about a problem that's like in the abstract and affecting financial systems and weather. It's like, this is hurting people today. Like, it's already hurt people. And, the way I sometimes think about it is like, if this was like an external enemy doing this, if this was a Godzilla or whatever, we would do something about it. But it's kind of happening everywhere all at once. I mean, incredibly fast, but like nobody does anything. So, if this was Godzilla going around stealing fish and burning, throwing hurricanes at cities and, hitting Mozambique twice in a month with a giant hurricane, like, would do something about it. But it's like non-personified, so we're kind of just watching, and we got to stop watching, start getting after it.
Yeah. And these are, communities of people who depend on the ocean, and you can speak for that community, Marty, but there's communities in the oceans that can't speak for themselves. And so, just raising the awareness and having more conversations about this is really, really important. And, Brad, in the beginning, you talked a little bit around there's too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and we need to mitigate risk, and removing CO2 is part of that mitigation. Will you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so we have passed the point where just turning off the flow of pollution will ameliorate this problem. We're at 420 plus parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, and as Kate's graph showed, we haven't seen those numbers for a long time. And the last time we did, there were camels in the Arctic. So we have to actually affect that number. And I'll just give you a couple reasons why. I mean, first is that we have really failed at reducing carbon emissions. Year on year, with every agreement that we've signed, carbon emissions have continued to go up. And just since Paris, just in the 6 or 7 years since the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest banks have invested $4.6 trillion in new carbon emitting infrastructure. So we will get there eventually if we survive on the planet. We will move to zero carbon, low carbon, clean energy, but it is a massive, massive undertaking. So that's one lever that we have. The other lever, I also want to just point out that we're tilting towards a target or a goal that's not safe. So we're working madly on a goal of this 1.5 degree target. I'm sure you've all heard it many times. Somehow we've incorporated this belief without really questioning it that that's a good place to be. It's not a good place to be. It's worse than we are now, right? We're at about 1.2. So basically we're working really hard to be worse off tomorrow, which is a really hard thing to tell your kids, which I have kids as well. And it's not a story they want to hear, right? They want to hear, how are we going to make this better? How are we going to fix this problem? Because basically every risk that we face is just on a continuum, and there's no bright line at 1.5 that says, oh, good, we're safe. The Godzilla has been defeated. So we need to clean up carbon, and this isn't just me saying this. The IPCC has been extremely clear, the science body for the UN climate meetings, climate organizations. We need to clean up between 100 and 1,000 gigatons of carbon over the course of this century, so in the next 77 years. A gigaton is a billion tons, so 1,000 billion tons is a trillion tons. It's a very, very large number. And this is just to get to 1.5. If we want to do better by our kids and hopefully grandkids and others, we need to go back and actually clean up our carbon footprint from the time we started making it. For the most part, as much as we can. A climate scientist will tell you that if you want to be safe, get below 350, and if you want to be really safe, get back down to around 280 parts per million, where we've been for the last 10,000 years, and where carbon's never really fluctuated over the past 800,000 years more than about 80 parts per million, and now we're wildly outside that bound. So that's why we need carbon removal, and that's what we're here. This is where we start getting positive. That's what we're here to talk about.
I think we need to do a double click on that, which is that we're working towards a goal that is much worse off than we are right now. Like, how did we even get there, right? And the experts say that if we surpass 450 parts per million, we're going to surpass 1.5 degrees Celsius. So everyone's trying to stay under that, but we're already going to be so much worse off. So I think, this is really important, carbon removal. If we're net zero, we stay at 420, right? We need to get at or below 350. And I remember, Marty, you said in one of our conversations, we should be aiming for 280, not like 350 or whatever, which is what some of the publications say. So we have a lot of work to do. Kate, will you walk us through some of the different pathways for removing carbon?
Oh, sure. Happy to do that. I guess this is the turning point. I just want to make a couple comments first before we continue. Some people say we're destroying the planet, but the planet's going to be just fine. It's really the fact that we're turning a planet into a planet that's not habitable with rich biodiversity that we've seen for so many thousands of years, and it's habitable for human life. And before I start on this, I just also want to say that there's a lot of times when going down this path, people have blamed some of us who talk about it with covering for those who want to continue to burn fossil fuels. That is not what this is about. This is exactly about what Brad just talked about. It is the fact that we have to, if we want to keep this rich biodiversity, including us, we have to remove CO2. And so the ocean is a large reservoir of CO2. In fact, the ocean has about 50 times more carbon in it than the pre-industrial atmosphere. And there's a various amount of physical and chemical, geochemical, and biological processes that actually interface with the carbon cycle. And so what we're talking about in much of this carbon dioxide removal is enhancing natural processes that occur in the ocean. And there's an expert in the room that I won't mention his name, but he's one who has been part of a study that I was on by the U.S. National Academies for Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And we looked at 6 different types of approaches for carbon dioxide removal. One of them is enhancing ocean fertilization. Some of you have heard of it, iron fertilization. It grows life on the surface of the ocean. That carbon then, when it dies, sinks and is removed from the atmosphere. There's also enhanced upwelling. In the ocean, there are places where there's upwelling of deep water into the coastal environment. That also brings nutrients up in a similar way that you would be then growing more carbon on the surface, and then when it dies, it goes to the deep ocean. There's an interest in enhancing and recovering our coastal ecosystems. Some people call that blue carbon. Of course, it's not a giant amount of carbon removal, but it has incredibly a wide range of other benefits in terms of actually working on that. And there are electrochemical procedures that are almost industrial-like, where you're actually using electrochemical processes to remove CO2 from the ocean water itself, that then allows more uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. And you're going to hear more about 2 other approaches that we've studied in this National Academy study, and that is seaweed cultivation, where you're growing macroalgae, capturing that CO2 in a carbon form. It dies, and then it is removed into the deep ocean. And then there's a final technology called enhanced alkalinity. And I think of, because I have studied the geologic record in the past, I think of when the Earth was quite hot, in the hothouse world, the Himalayas were uplifted, and a lot of minerals were moved from the Himalayas into the ocean, which caused enhanced alkalinity and actually started the process in a slow way in cooling the planet. But we can enhance it, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. So those are the technologies that we have in place, and it's really just cranking up what our ocean does already.
Yeah, when we think about the scale of carbon removal and all the different pathways that the ocean offers, there's a lot there. So adding to your vocabulary of sea ice and polar vortex hopefully is at least one pathway that Kate has talked about today. And with respect to one of the specific pathways, macroalgae, would love to have.
Well, I have one more topic.
Oh, one more.
Yes, I just wanted to add one actual technology that wasn't included in the study that we did was a project that I'm leading for my organization called Solid Carbon. And this is combining the advancement of direct air capture on some kind of ocean platform and pumping it through the water column and eventually injecting it into subsea floor ocean basalt. We've learned from Icelandic researchers and technologists that when you inject CO2 into basalt, it turns into rock in a short amount of years. Because most of the basalt is in the ocean, we're interested in making this one of those large-scale technologies that is complementary to the technologies I just talked about, but also has that capacity to really make a dent in the CO2. And we call this, these reservoirs are really the garbage dump where you put the CO2.
Awesome. Marty, will you talk to us about macroalgae and seaweed?
All right, just to like level set before I get into the, a specific solution, like what carbon removal is moving mass. So we've moved a bunch of mass carbon mass from the slow cycle to the fast cycle. It's like releasing a spring. But there's all this mass. It's up in the atmosphere, up in the upper layer of the ocean, and in the biosphere, we have a bunch of carbon mass. And we need to move that into the slow cycle. So all the solutions that she just talked about, it's about just moving mass, doing work, literal definition of work, from the fast cycle to the slow cycle. So we need to move the carbon into the slow cycle, underground, in the deep ocean, et cetera. So when you think about carbon removal and you see different technologies, and I'll talk about ours and whatever, all it is just moving mass. It's dump trucks, it's ships, it's rails, it's pipelines, it's moving stuff. It's giant fans that are moving a tremendous amount of air. When we're talking about carbon removal and we're talking about getting to 280 ppm, you're talking about moving more mass than has ever been moved in the history of the world. And we have to do it in a timeline like super compressed. So if you want to know if we're serious about climate change, look outside, and if you don't see dump trucks and you don't see trains and you don't see ships moving, we're not serious. We're losing, and everything's going to die that you care about. So like, I'm not like, sometimes it's like, we got to simplify it, and it's like, if you don't look outside and see it, we're not doing it at any meaningful scale, because this is going to be the biggest industry that's ever happened. And it's separate from decarbonization. You have to decarbonize, absolutely, but this is a separate problem. And we tie them together through net zero. Net zero is how we lose. Straight up, that's how we lose. We just lose a little slower. A little slower. So the question on like when you're talking about what technologies and what solutions to use, it's like what's the most efficient way to move the mass? So we have to move the mass. It's a tremendous amount of work. We should just get after it and start moving it. You can do it through moving minerals and increasing alkalinity in the ocean. You can do it by moving iron into the ocean for fertilization, and then you get some leverage off photosynthesis. You can move what we do. We make little buoys out of terrestrial biomass and some minerals, and then set them and spray some kelp spores on them and spread them out in the ocean, and then the macroalgae, seaweed, will grow, accumulate a bunch of extra mass, and then sink to the deep ocean. So it's a way to get like some extra leverage on top of the mass we move. But it's definitely the prettiest carbon removal. I like to think, but at the end of the day, it's just leverage on mass transfer. You just have to move mass. And there's a bunch of little technologies and tweaks, and how do we do it the most efficient? And do we use photosynthesis, or do we use chemistry, or do we use machines? They're all good, but we're not doing any of them at any meaningful scale. We spend more on lawnmowers than we do on carbon removal. And I'm all for cut grass, it smells good, but like, we spend like 20-something billion dollars on lawnmowers every year, and we're not spending a tenth of that on carbon removal. And we need to so we're not doing it. Like, we have a bunch of little companies that are working, and everyone's, cranking as hard as we can, but like, we're just this little tiny thing, this little speck, and it needs to be the biggest thing you've ever seen. So, I'm not being pessimistic. I just want people to level set on like, we're not doing it. And if anyone says like, oh, this thing's overfunded or that thing's overfunded, $4.6 trillion invested to move more mass from the slow cycle to the fast cycle. On the order of a couple $1 billion ever invested in like really true hardcore fast to slow carbon removals. We're not doing it. So
Moving mass.
Moving mass.
That's
what carbon removal is. That's how you get out of this
term.
problem, is you do a bunch of work. You just move the mass. So, and the ocean's a great place to do it, efficient place to move mass. You can get some leverage.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Gives us the scale that we need.
Yeah.
So seaweed and macroalgae are one way to move mass, and alkalinity is another ocean pathway.
Sorry, before I speak to this slide, I just want to emphasize again what Kate said. The ocean is already the largest carbon cycler on the planet. If we all disappear tomorrow, over the next few 100,000 years, the ocean processes, both biological and chemical, will eventually clean this carbon mess out of the atmosphere. It's just what it does. And it did it after that big extinction event that Kate showed earlier. So the question that we're all asking is, can we enhance any of those processes? Can we mimic? Can we accelerate? And you've heard about a couple. This is a third. This basically draws on the chemical power of the ocean to shift carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the deep ocean, what I like, a phrase somebody has coined, deep blue carbon, where it's safe and inert, not where it's free and active in the upper layer of the ocean, causing that acidification that we talked about, but where it is safely stored for tens of thousands of years. And that is what the ocean would do if we disappeared. So the ways that works is basically the weathering of rock that Kate talked about with the Himalayas. Alkaline ions run off of the land from rainfall and rain events into the ocean, increasing ever so subtly the alkalinity of the ocean. Ocean has a pH level, and if you increase, and we've been decreasing that pH level with acidification, making it more acidic. If you increase it, it enables the ocean to suck up more carbon out of the atmosphere. And it's a complex chemical equation, but suffice it to say, it turns fast carbon into slow carbon. It's a great, easier way to say it over time, into carbonates and bicarbonate form. So there's a bunch of ways that this can happen. One is simply grinding up alkaline rock and interacting it with seawater. And there's a couple of companies that are doing this on beaches. So as we nourish beaches, which we spend a lot of money doing, what if we put alkaline material on those beaches and let the wave action interact? You know, what kind of an impact could we have? So that's one way. You can also grind it up and spread it on ships. Now, of course, grinding takes a lot of energy, and we don't want to use fossil energy to do that. That would be, that would just be dumb. So we're going to have large sources of renewable energy to do that. You can also create alkaline liquid through these electrochemical processes that I think Kate also referred to, where you basically strip molecules apart and create a base stream and an acidic stream. The acidic stream could be injected into rock cores, like solid carbon, and the base, which is alkaline, can be put back into the water. And there's a number of startups in this space. You can learn about all of these pathways, shameless plug, on our website, oceanvisions.org. We have roadmaps. They're not documents, they're digital databases around every one of these pathways. Alkalinity enhancement, seaweed, microalgae, blue carbon, and electrochemistry. And it also tells you all of the things that are needed to quickly move these forward. So while I agree with Marty, this is nascent. We have to poise ourselves for exponential growth. This is going to require exponential growth over the next few decades. And you've got to build a solid base. It's like when they were mapping the human genome. They said they were going to do it in 7 years, and biggest, enormous effort. After 1 year, they were about 1% of the way there, and they asked the science lead on it. They said, well, God, you must be depressed. You're only 1% of the way there. He said, no, because this is going to be exponential. And it was, and they ended up mapping the human genome well ahead of that time frame. We're going to need that sort of innovation. We're going to need 1,000 shots on goal, as a colleague of ours likes to say. We need every idea. There's no idea dumb enough to not at least investigate right now. We are in an emergency, and we have to act like it.
Yeah. Again, more information to process in terms of how our oceans help us remove carbon and why that is so important. And there are several different pathways. How do we know what constitutes a good pathway? What are the factors that we should think about?
So what constitutes a good pathway? I think you have to measure two things. You have to have, you measure the efficiency of the net effect of the solution you do. So What's the global effect? What's the net flux of carbon from the fast cycle to the slow cycle, and like, how much did it cost? That's one thing. And how quickly can you do it, and how much more of it can you do? Then the other thing you have to measure is the local effects, like what I call the Goldilocks zone of life through everywhere that your solution touches. And you don't want, just like we don't want the ocean to get too acidic, we don't want it to get too basic in any area because it could hurt life in that area. So the way the way I think about it is like, okay, what's the net effect and how efficient is that across like the globe for the solution? And then how does that affect the Goldilocks zone? And like basically, if you can stay within the Goldilocks zone and you have a net effect, like do it. We have to do it. So that's like the two rubrics I use in my head for assessing solutions. And like, look, every one of them that we've talked about works. And then it's a matter of like tuning. How much do you do in one spot? How much do you do in the other? What's the supply chain? How do you tune that up, tune that down? They all work from a net effect, and they can all work within the Goldilocks zone if we measure it. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and the other aspects is something that Brad also mentioned, is that we can't be using fossil energy for any of these. So we need to be sure that we're not only not using fossil energy, for the solid carbon project we're talking about, we're hoping to start at offshore British Columbia, which is 97% renewable energy already in terms of the electrical grid. But we are embedding into that project our own renewable energy so that we're not pulling already existing renewable that's needed for decarbonization. So it's a values aspect that we all in this industry have to be following so that we're not making the problem worse. And it's also important to look at durability. If you're going to put effort and work into removal of CO2 and putting it somewhere, the durability aspect has a great value, because you want to try to do it once. And then once you do it once, it is there for millennia.
I agree with all of that. I would add that we're in the realm of least bad alternatives. That's where we are. It's just a fact. There's no silver bullet. There's not going to be something that's clean and beautiful and cleans up this mess. I mean, think of other pollution cleanup operations that you might have some mental image of, like dredging toxic metals out of bays, giant industrial projects. There is going to be a measure of large-scale industry to this, but this is the future we have on the planet. We've engineered this planet to the point of extreme destabilization of the systems that we all depend on, and now we're going to have to engineer it back. And so we just have to again, look at every single possible pathway and measure them against each other based on fossil fuel or carbon footprint, the full life cycle analysis, what impacts they have on the Goldilocks zone and other forms of life on the planet, what impact they have on human communities. How do we distribute that impact equitably, which we have clearly not done with the fossil fuel industry. The impacts of that, the benefits and impacts are distributed very unequally. We can't repeat that same set of problems with this new enterprise.
I think the scale piece, again, I come back to this often because the ocean does offer scale that land-based technologies may not be able to. And I want to talk a little bit on the numbers. In terms of the ocean and potentially what it can remove, can the panel talk to what numbers you believe are on the board?
Well, I mean, I personally think it's too early to tell. I know the National Academy study that Kate was on put some estimates, but this is the beginning of an industry, and so it'd be like estimating how many smartphones there were going to be globally when we first saw the first smartphone. Nobody would have ever guessed that there would be more smartphones than people, or some bizarre number like that, right? So I think it's really early to tell. The ocean has the capacity, as we've shown, the capacity to solve this problem theoretically. Now the question is, can that theoretical capacity be turned into real capacity?
I think it's clear that as humans, we are pretty good at big projects. So, and that's been proven by things like some people compare these industry growths to in the United States in World War II, when the United States came late, very late into World War II, the industrial base ramped up in months into this giant industry. And so the capacity to do that is there. And it's really the will. And also, I find it I sit in a space that's largely academic. Even in the academic community, the sense of urgency hasn't permeated that entire community either. And so it's up to all of us to continue to really speak about this. And also, I also like to say, when people challenge, oh, geoengineering is going to hurt the planet, what do you think we're doing right now? We're doing the largest geoengineering experiment ever. And so it's really explaining that to others so that there can be collective action.
Yeah, so how do we actually get the ocean solutions to scale? What are the challenges today that your organizations and ocean carbon removal in general are facing?
Yeah, I mean, first thing was you need money, right? So how do you, to do, this is going to be an industrial activity, right? I mean, it's interfacing with nature, and we need to have you have to have really good fingertip feel for what's happening in nature. But this is an industrial activity we're talking about. It's actually a little bit beyond that. It's like an Earth scale problem, so we need Earth scale solutions. We do that through industry. How do you fund this industry is like part of the challenge. You fund the industry. Right now we have compliance markets and voluntary markets that are basically, these corporations will emit carbon from the slow cycle to the fast cycle. That's a liability. They need to offset that liability with a credit, a fast to slow credit. Okay, so how do you make a fast to slow credit? You go do the work, you measure it, you make sure you stay within the Goldilocks zone, and there's the big challenge is like, how do we set up permission structures, governance, methodologies, all of this really boring plumbing of civilization, plumbing of financial infrastructure, sensor systems, et cetera. You link all that together in a coherent way that then can generate that credit. That's an offset to the liability that got generated by people emitting carbon. This is how, in the short term, this is what we do. So this is how we're going to do this. So we're going to have to work out that, making that risk transfer, that removal of the liability for the corporations work. I know this sounds really nerdy, but this is fundamentally what we have to figure out, and then what we're engaged in every day. Once we figure that out, so you have the measurement systems, you can prove what you did, moved carbon from the fast cycle to the slow cycle, it passes audit, and then you can use it to meet these compliance concerns. Okay, now we jumpstart the industry. But that only gets us to net zero, or it actually probably doesn't get us all the way to net zero. It gets us a little bit of the way. Then we have to figure out, and this is probably but that's a scale up of 10 to 15 years. Then we have to figure out, how do we remove the debt? All the carbon that's been emitted before the present day. And that's going to have to come through monetary policy for the government. That's going to be a tremendous amount of money. We'll have to figure that out in the future. But in the short term, it's all about figuring out how you prove the work you did, moved the carbon from the fast cycle to the slow cycle, stayed within the Goldilocks zone, and then how you deliver that data package to the corporations that have to buy the credits in you have to, how you build that data package and who that has to flow through, et cetera. So kind of nerdy stuff, but that's what we're working on.
So just to add a couple thoughts to that. First, going before what Marty's even talking about, we have to make CDR a thing, right? I mean, how many of you came into this room thinking that it was urgent to work on carbon removal? Excellent. But still, that's still, I mean, and this is not a random sample.
That's depressing.
Well, that's good. So we need everybody to think that, right? You gotta challenge back when people tell you that we're going to solve the climate crisis by a slow path to decarbonization. It is not true. It is patently false. Or at least the probabilities are so low that it's not a risk worth taking. So we need to make CDR a thing. And once it becomes a thing, then people will start investing in it. The government is spending almost no money on this until the last couple of big bills that were passed. And they're almost entirely spending it on terrestrial approaches at this point, while the ocean is 70% of the planet. So making it a thing is really big. Massive federal investment and government investment to de-risk these technologies, there's no way Marty and Running Tide can de-risk the field of macroalgae. It's just not possible for an entrepreneur to do that. The dollar amounts are too big. But it's like the mRNA vaccine, right? The government de-risked those vaccines by investing over many billions of dollars, and then a private company came in and did great, right? We have to follow that same sort of approach, but it's got to be a thing. It's got to be urgent. We need to talk about it and move people on it.
I'll just talk about one other challenge, and that is the ocean. I operate big infrastructure in the ocean, and it's not easy. And so it's really ensuring that we invest in the technologies to operate systems in the ocean. I mean, it's the most challenging environment of any kind of industrial effort. Because I'm from Canada, we recently had a minister of transportation that is an astronaut, and he was visiting us many times, and I would say to him, Minister, as you know, operating sensor systems in space is easy. It is so much harder by thousands and thousands of times to operate sensor systems in the ocean. So we also have to invest in that innovation piece. And one of the ways that I think the United States is one of the countries that has been investing in innovation through one of the biggest ways they do it, and that is through government procurement. And so I think we have to be actually pushing the government down that path, which is exactly the MNRA, is using that lever to begin to advance these technologies.
We have a lot of work ahead of us, but it's worth the effort to get CDR, to get ocean carbon removal on the agenda. And so, with the room pretty full of people, we'll get to some Q&A at the end, but I would love for each of the panelists to have a call to action for something that, everyday people can do to get this going.
Well, my call to action is that we need to make this urgent, that we need to question the conventional orthodoxy that this climate path we're on, this goal that we're pursuing, is safe, good for humanity, good for nature. It's just not. The risks are too high. We're already flirting with really dangerous risks. So we need to reinvent a climate agenda, and that takes people talking about it, asking questions about it, questioning that sort of conventional wisdom that we're on this path. And also questioning the banks and the oil companies that continue to invest in building a future that is extremely dangerous. We need to operate like this is an emergency, like we did during COVID. People from around the globe worked together 24/7. They dropped what they were working on and worked on this issue. This is a far bigger emergency, and we're sort of sleepwalking through it. We have to change that.
That's a good analogy. With COVID, it was such an emergency, our lives changed, and we're getting there with climate, but, if we act earlier, maybe we're not going to find ourselves in that situation. Kate, call to action?
Well, I just think because of the fact that we're here focused on, obviously we need all aspects of carbon dioxide removal, but the ocean is a big opportunity. And it's interesting. I live in this world of observing the ocean and delivering data 24/7 in real time, but sharing with others the fact that we're on an ocean planet. I think it's hard for people who don't go out much anymore in the woods, but also to really re-emphasize that we sit and live on an ocean planet is really important to communicate to everyone.
Get really mad, like really mad, and then call your whatever institution out there that you know of and tell them they're not doing enough, because they're not. Like, just get mad. Like, you should be mad, and you should be scared, and you shouldn't be scared. You should just be mad, and we just demand more from our leaders and the institutions that support them. Because I think there's a lot of people that are stuck in a frame of mind that's like fairly passive. And it's just like the math is there, the science is there. We just have to move a bunch of mass. And so anything that's in the way of that, you have to call up and get them out of the way.
So you're calling for mass movement.
I'm calling yeah. I mean, I don't call every institution that's a part of anything that touches any of this and just call them up. This is call your senators, call your congressmen, demand companies that you buy from buy carbon removal credits. Demand the nonprofits that you donate to are doing something to move mass, not, we have to do the work. We know we need to do it. We're going to say we can't sit for another 8 years and wait. It just gets worse and worse and worse. There's more damage. So just get mad and start making phone calls. And if you can, then get into moving the mass. That's the best part. But then you do the work. But at the very least, call, get angry and get mobilized. Yeah.
And if you're working at a company that has programs for philanthropy or volunteer, that's the world that I came from. I came from the tech space and from the corporate world, and there's a lot of talk of ESG and this and that. And whenever you think of climate, you think green and trees and all this stuff. But actually, you should be thinking about whales and waves and everything that the ocean provides. And I think we need to kind of switch that mentality. And so my call to action is for every time someone mentions something about a land-based solution, like planting a tree or whatever, just say whale 5 times, or sea ice, or polar vortex, because we need to change the vernacular. Right now, we're not really thinking in the right direction. So appreciate everyone being here. I'm going to open up the floor to Q&A. I would love to hear some questions. There's a microphone there, so please feel free to get in there.
Thank you very much for your talks. That was really interesting, and appreciate your enthusiasm for Ocean CDR. I think you said at the beginning, and I agree with this, that we need both massive decarbonization, accelerated, and carbon removal. That's both and, not either or. But then you raised the question, an important question about where's all the money going to come from for financing carbon dioxide removal, and you noted, at least at the front end, kind of carbon offsets or compliance markets, where companies who would be otherwise reducing their emissions are going to pay to avoid reducing some of their fossil fuel emissions in order to invest in removal technologies. In which case it's an offset. You're saying we're going to allow you to pollute more in order to invest in CDR. How do you square that? Because I can't, with the need to accelerate both ends. How do you avoid what people call the moral hazard associated with that?
Don't let companies make commitments to net zero. Companies need to have commitments to real zero, and then that problem goes away. Real zero is exactly what Microsoft is committed to. They've committed to clean up their entire carbon footprint by 2050, historic carbon footprint. That's what we need. That means you're stopping emitting and you're cleaning it all up, full stop. The science-based targets approach is not actually science-based targets. Those are set to the wrong goal. We need real zero, and that means both cleanup and stopping emitting.
Decarbonization is this big of a problem. Carbon removal is this big of a problem. Like, if you look at how much money it's going to cost to do both of those things over time, how much effort it's going to be, the bigger project is carbon removal. It's harder and it's bigger. And production ramps don't switch on overnight. You don't flip a switch and you have 100,000, 30,000 ton ships moving mass into the ocean to buffer out all the acidity. That'll take longer than decarbonization. So you have to start it now. So to me, the bigger project is removing all the carbon. You need to start now. And that's just because industrial ramps, production ramps take time. And also, decarbonization there is no, it's not one for one. You're not going to just like Apple, they're net zero, to hit net zero by I think it's 2035. I don't know the exact numbers, so just bear with me a little bit, give me a little slack. I think that they can only they can decarbonize with all their cash, making really, tight little products, all their cash. They still have 8 megatons of residual carbon removals to do by 2035 to get to net zero. Still, with everything every lever they can possibly pull with all their cash, they still need 8 megatons of removals to hit net zero. If they don't start investing in that today, that supply won't exist.
No, that's amazing because, I work actually for the #1 CDR marketplace. I'm an advisor for them at the moment, and I'm experiencing this and speaking to the corporates firsthand, right? From your largest airlines to the largest tech companies, utilities, the large utilities, the largest asset management funds. There's tons of money, and wealthy people, especially millennials and coming online, the Gen Zs, would love for their asset managers, to invest in these technologies. That's great, but who's going to then buy the offtake, right? These are just rich people that want their money to multiply at the end of the day. When you're looking at the real asset owners who are investing in the funds that are then investing in the terrestrial projects and more the ocean-based projects. My thing is to say that these are luxury tons at the moment, and that's probably why these are priced $100+ per ton. That's one of the main issues that I've encountered, right? Like when you can buy them for $3 or $6 or $10 a ton because they're terrestrial based. It's a totally different animal than a $100, $200, $1,000. Yet, methodologies still haven't been concretized, right? So my question to you guys is, what areas for ocean acidification, combating ocean acidification are best? I'm thinking California, Patagonia, South Africa, Scotland, Norway. Like what are coastal regions the main first? Like, is it geographically based? Is that the smart solution? Because people in Nebraska don't really care about the ocean. I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm going to Warren Buffett next month. Just going to catch a vibe. They don't care about the ocean, right? So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, how does this fit into the SDGs, right? Like, how are we, as a person of color, I notice in climate there aren't other people, maybe the people of color who are brown. Okay, let me just put it that way. There are 1 billion people in Africa plus. Where are we in this whole, and I say we because I speak globally, even though I'm from Chicago. I live in San Francisco though, so don't cry for me. It's a horrible place, but whatever. The SDGs, how does this fit into the SDGs? Yeah, I fit my hot takes in there as well, so I apologize to everyone.
Well, I just want to start by saying I do think that from an investment perspective, we should be following some of the leadership in the reinsurance industry, where some of the big reinsurance industries are really insisting that the companies that they are insuring are investing a certain percentage in what they used to call negative emission technologies or carbon dioxide removal. Because of the fact that I showed you that slide about the costs of this are going to be hitting that are impacting the insurance industry. So they're seeing it sooner. So I think that's one aspect. I just want to touch on where I work. What we're doing heavily is really engaging and empowering our coastal indigenous communities. And we're also collectively working on indigenous communities around the entire Pacific, because it's really those communities that are going to be heavily impacted. And if we can provide technology, training, et cetera, to be part of this industry, then they become part of this industry.
Just one quick thing, carbon tax. As soon as this is monetized and it costs you money to pollute, serious money, we will start to solve this problem very quickly. And so back to what you can do, advocate for a carbon tax. The social cost of carbon was calculated at around something like $230 a ton. That's what the real cost is.
Just not make it dystopian where we're then judged based on our kilograms and how much we can put out, but based on, okay, what assets you own, so on your tax ledger, as well as the corporate. So we start with a corporate carbon tax, and then start with a homeowner-based corporate ledger, because I still rent, and I don't want you're 89 kilo, so you can only emit this much carbon, and you can only own this type of car. I think it should start with people who have actual land, then their carbon is taxed. I mean, that's because I've thought about the dystopian, how it gets to that point. And thank you for your comments.
I think we covered private investment. I work for a national laboratory which is owned and operated by the Department of Energy. Fossil energy and carbon management will be one of those places where we hope to get more investment. We need to switch them off of their focus on fossil energy and get them there towards carbon management and carbon capture. Government funding is needed. Where else besides the Department of Energy in that particular office do you see congressional appropriations being directed to leverage that big government funding that can do what corporate folks maybe cannot or maybe are not willing to do?
Every department of the government is going to be affected by this. NOAA for sure, ocean atmospheric, right? Bureau of like land management. I mean, you really have to think about the scale of this problem. We have to remove more carbon. The weight is more than every living thing on the weight of every living thing on the surface of the earth, right? And so these supply chains that support this are going to be everywhere, and they're going to touch every part of the government. It could come from the Department of Defense as well. It's a national security issue. there could absolutely be a ton of funding funneled through that, and I'm sure that they are looking at it. I'm positive that I've read all the, every one of the branch of the military. One of their top 2 focuses is climate change and how it's going to affect them. And it even said, like, the Department of Navy even has remediation efforts as part of their core mission. So every part of the government, everything that touches land, industry, education, kind of everything.
But I'd agree, defense is really the place that they have the most money and they have the most risk, because all of the studies associated with climate change and what we're talking about is the biggest security risk on the planet. And so that's certainly where I'd go next from after DOE.
That's right.
So I have a distillery in a fishing village in Greenport, New York. And I've been applying for a grant through the Rural Business Grant Program from the Farm Bill. And every year, they're telling me that they love my proposal. I'm applying with SUNY Stony Brook that has a great program on clean water. And every year I get rejected. And I was wondering, my goal is to take my effluent, which is currently run through a bioreactor, and use it for hydroponic farming. And I was wondering if you have any advice on these grant proposals. Thank you.
But you're partnering with scientists at Stony Brook, right? Yeah. And so are they giving you reviews? Are you telling you what's wrong?
No, not really. And they're very...
Okay, so here's what I would do if I were. I would go to Stony Brook and go to the research office and say, ask them why I'm getting negative reviews, because if you can address the negative reviews, you win. I mean, that's push on the research office should be helping you tremendously. And don't let them sit there in their office and not call the funders.
Hi, thanks, great talk. The National Academy's paper, also fantastic work. One big number we didn't mention today is the $400 billion from the IRA, which did not need a carbon tax to be legislated. And I think it's fair to say that that bill will sort of single-handedly bring the CCUS stack and hydrogen industries into existence. The National Academy's paper recommended $1.4 billion in research over the next 10 years. Was that ambitious enough? If that instead got $100 billion today, would that maybe have more of an impact than the IRA? And how do we get an IRA for the ocean?
You know, there's not a lot of money in the IRA that we're aware of for ocean-based pathways. So that's an issue. I believe the National Academy's estimates are low, and it's going to need much more. We did a paper just on research questions around macroalgae. What needs to be answered for sinking, not for sinking macroalgae, in order to be considered as a viable pathway. And the research for that had about a $500 million to $1 billion price tag, just for one sub-pathway in one area. So I think the National Academy's study is way under, and we need a lot more money. But I do like a tax better than appropriations, because appropriations take forever to work their way through the federal system and then forever to get allocated. And a tax, businesses pay a lot of attention.
I would also prefer a carbon tax, but I guess just practically speaking, hydrogen, CCS, and DAC are going to exist because of the IRA, and ocean CDI is still way off.
But we have to change what's practical, right? We alluded earlier or talked about World War II. We nationalized industries in order to produce things that we needed to produce. There's no reason that that's not possible. No reason except for public apathy or lack of anger and motivation to get that done.
Hello, thank you. I'm asking this question as a fundraiser by profession, and I'm curious, how are organizations like all of yours organizing yourselves to collaborate, aggregate a shareable message, share best practices, measure success, etc.? I'm curious.
Well, so Ocean Visions is actually a big collaborative network, and Kate's organization is part of it, Woods Hole, which is in the audience, and Scripps, and Stanford, and others, along with a bunch of accelerators and investor partners. So we're based on trying to move a whole bunch of institutions forward. We actually have teams of advisors that work with Running Tide, as an example, and 5 other startups. So that's sort of our whole model.
Thank you for a very fascinating and frankly terrifying presentation. And I like the way you seem to have very clear thinking about the fast carbon cycle and the slow carbon cycle. So if you could help me out, so we're going to grow a whole bunch of seaweed, and we're going to sink it to the bottom of the ocean. Give me step by step what happens there. We're going to make more coal. It's going to go anaerobic on us. Help me
Oil.
Because I'm not sure I'm buying this.
How does that work? So, I mean, where did oil come from? Oil's dead plant matter that sunk to the bottom of ancient oceans. That's where it came from. So we're going to make more of it. Just reverse the cycle, right? It's like they put an oil rig in reverse and put the organic matter back down into that conveyor belt, the deep ocean conveyor belt that starts that process over again.
Do we have some experimental data that shows that this is reasonable?
Yeah, this is first principles of oceanography, where you go below the thermocline. There's a deep ocean conveyor belt. Most of organic matter that falls to the bottom of the ocean will likely sediment in like the abyssal plain where there's tons of mud, and then the one that whatever gets eaten and respirated will be in the deep ocean conveyor belt, which can take anywhere from 400 to 1,000 years to pop back up in an upwelling zone. It all depends on where you do it. You have to do a tremendous job mapping the oceans and mapping the ocean currents on the surface and on the bottom, but a lot of that work has been done. There's a tremendous amount of knowledge about how the ocean works. Now there's subtleties to that. Okay, like how much of the, exactly, but and then there's a lot we don't know about how these systems operate, but we have to start. And then by starting and putting out all these systems and putting out all these sensor systems, we'll be able to learn more, and we'll filter back through and we'll iterate, and we'll get better at where we put it and how we do it. My company's not a macroalgae company at all. We're like a measurement company, and we have a bunch of solutions that we use. We do alkalinity, we do all sorts of coastal restoration activities, et cetera. We're going to aim at what generates the biggest net effect, and over time that knowledge will evolve, and then we'll be measuring the Goldilocks zone to make sure that we're keeping life within right where we want it, wherever our activities happen. This isn't going to happen. We can't just sit around and wait for some perfect thing off 30-year-old data, some perfect paper to come out that says this is the perfect solution and we just scale on that. It's you have to start moving mass and figuring it out.
And I think it's important to say we also at the same time, from my perspective, we have to help develop the monitoring, reporting, and verification. That has to go in parallel. And so that's exactly what Marty's talking about, is that we'll be, for each of these, we'll be working with places like our organization that can actually begin to document what's happening when you put something in the deep ocean. So we have real-time cameras, we have real-time sensors, and so we'll be monitoring these things to actually put some numbers to it so you can understand the time frame and the actual fate of the carbon in various water depths. So we're still learning, but I mean the overall picture that Marty is correct, but you need to have those monitoring aspects to verify that carbon removal.
Ultimately, my question is, what market mechanisms, specifically around price, do y'all need to see happen in the next 1 or 2 years that we get carbon removal on a gigaton track? The quick context behind it is, if we get all the physics and chemistry of these perfected, I still worry that they'll all fail because we can't put a value on moving a mass of CO2, and that the voluntary markets may collapse because decarbonization is so far off track, and that the compliance markets just don't move fast enough. So I'm just curious, what are those market mechanisms that you see need to happen to support the solutions?
So just quickly, I'll reiterate, a tax would be awesome. I don't think it's impossible. They have them in, it's not outside the realm of possibility. I think recalibrating company commitments to zero carbon, to real zero, would have a huge impact. We're letting companies slide with a science-based target that's not actually based on any true climate science, that it's a safe target. So if we set everybody's target to where Microsoft is, that would create a race, and then verifying people's production or performance against those commitments is super important. But at the end of the day, monetary policy by governments is going to be what makes this happen.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you.